The storm was so fierce that night, I could barely see my own hands on the ship's railing, but I'll never forget the sound of those tiny cries cutting through the thunder. The wind was howling like a banshee, waves crashing over my deck every few seconds, and there I was, a 63-year-old man who should have known better than to be out in weather like that. But grief makes you do foolish things. I was sailing solo off the coast of Maine after losing my wife Martha just 3 months before. The ocean had always been my refuge, my place to think, to heal, to remember. That night, I wasn't looking for adventure or purpose. I was just a broken-hearted old fisherman thinking life had nothing left to give me, nothing left to take from me either. The rain was coming down in sheets so thick I could barely make out the bow of my own boat. I'd been sailing these waters for 40 years, knew every rock and current like the back of my weathered hands, but that storm was testing even my experience. I was about to turn back toward harbor when I heard it, a sound that cut through the wind and waves like nothing I'd ever experienced. A baby crying. Not just one baby, but what sounded like 2 distinct voices, tiny and desperate, somewhere out there in that black, churning water. I thought I was losing my mind. Grief does that sometimes. Makes you hear things that aren't there, see shadows where there's only emptiness. But those cries kept coming, getting closer, and my heart started pounding harder than it had since the day I found Martha collapsed in our kitchen. What happened next saved me from the darkness I had been drowning in for months, gave me reason to wake up every morning again. But the real miracle, the one that still gives me chills when I think about it, came 20 years later, when a knock on my door shattered everything I thought I knew about that night, about those babies, about the choices I made in those desperate moments when lightning was my only source of light. You know, I need to back up a bit and tell you why I was out there in the first place, why a man my age was risking his neck in a storm that would send most sailors running for cover. Martha and we tried for years to have children. We went through everything: doctors, treatments, prayers, hope followed by heartbreak month after month. Finally, when I was 38 and she was 35, Martha got pregnant. We were over the moon, started painting the nursery, picking out names, imagining our future as a family of 3. But our son, we were going to call him James. He never took his first breath. The cord wrapped around his neck during delivery, and just like that, our dreams were gone. Martha held him for hours, this perfect little boy who looked just like her, and I've never seen pain like what was in her eyes that day. We tried to heal together, tried to move forward, but some wounds run too deep. The house felt empty. The nursery door stayed closed, and we threw ourselves into work instead of dealing with what we'd lost. That's why I was out there that October night in 2003. The grief from losing Martha had mixed with all that old pain, and the sea was the only place I could go where the memories couldn't follow me. Or so I thought. I'm sharing this story here because I've learned something important in my 83 years. Family isn't just about blood or genetics or the children you plan to have. Sometimes family finds you in the most unexpected ways, in the middle of storms you never saw coming. If you've ever wondered whether life gives second chances, whether there's still hope when everything seems lost, then you'll want to hear what happened next. This story changed everything I believed about fate, about purpose, about what it means to be a father when you thought that chance had passed you by. Please leave in comments where you're watching this old man from. And if this story touches you, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. It was October 15th, 2003, a date I'll remember until my dying day. I'd taken my old fishing boat, Wanderer, out past Bar Harbor, maybe 12 miles offshore where the water gets deep and dark. She wasn't much to look at, 32 feet of weathered wood and rust that I'd been nursing along for 20 years, but she was reliable, and more importantly, she was mine. That night, it was just me, my thoughts, and yes, I'll admit it, a bottle of Irish whiskey that I'd been working on since sunset. The weather had been decent when I left the dock around 6, but Maine weather changes faster than a politician's promises. By 9 o'clock, the wind had picked up to maybe 40 knots, and the waves were building into something serious. I should have headed back, but honestly, I didn't much care what happened to me. Martha had been gone 3 months, and every morning I woke up to an empty house that still smelled like her perfume, still had her coffee cup in the sink from that last morning. I was just sitting there in the wheelhouse, engine idling to keep me steady in the swells, when I heard those cries I told you about. At first, I thought it might be seabirds. Sometimes gulls make sounds that can fool you, especially in wind like that. But this was different. This was unmistakably human, unmistakably desperate. I grabbed my spotlight and started sweeping the water, and that's when I saw her. There was this little yellow dinghy, maybe 8 feet long, bobbing around like a cork about 50 yards off my starboard side. Inside it, wrapped in what looked like a blue hospital blanket, was a baby. A tiny thing. Couldn't have been more than 3 or 4 months old, crying with everything she had. I got the Wanderer as close as I could and managed to grab the dinghy's bow line. The baby, I later named her Mia, was soaked through, shivering, but alive and fighting mad about her situation. I was still trying to process what I was looking at when I heard another sound, fainter but definitely there. Another baby crying, coming from somewhere behind me. I secured the dinghy and followed the sound with my spotlight until I found him. A little boy in what looked like a plastic storage crate, the kind you might use for fishing gear. He was wrapped in a green towel, just as small as the girl, just as cold and wet. 2 babies, in the middle of the Atlantic, in a storm that was getting worse by the minute. I got them both aboard and into the cabin where it was warm and dry. No identification, no notes, no clues about where they'd come from, or how they'd ended up floating around in the middle of nowhere. The girl had a small bracelet with M on it, and the boy had what looked like a handmade tag, with L stitched into his towel. That's all I had to go on. M and L. 2 letters for 2 lives that had somehow found their way to me. I knew I had to call the Coast Guard. Knew there were procedures for this kind of thing. So I got on the radio and reported what I'd found. The response I got still makes my blood boil. The duty officer, some kid who probably wasn't old enough to shave, told me to bring them to the nearest port where Child Protective Services would take over. Probably end up in the state orphanage, he said, like he was talking about lost luggage instead of human beings. That's when something changed in me. I looked down at these 2 tiny faces, these babies who had survived whatever circumstances had put them in those boats, and I thought about Martha. I thought about her James, about the nursery we'd never used, about all the love we'd had ready to give that never found its way to a child. The boy had stopped crying and was looking right at me with these dark eyes that seemed way too old for his face. The girl had grabbed onto my finger with this grip that was surprisingly strong. I keyed the radio again and told the Coast Guard I'd handle the situation myself. Before I could change my mind, before I could think about all the reasons why a 63-year-old widower had no business raising 1 child, let alone 2, I looked at those tiny faces and said words I'd never planned to say. Don't worry, little ones. You're coming home with Grandpa. Before I tell you how I managed to raise 2 babies at my age, let me share something that still keeps me awake some nights. Something that makes what happened that October evening feel like more than just chance. This goes back to 1993, about 10 years before I found Mia and Leo. Martha and I had been married 15 years by then, and we'd stopped talking about children. Not because we didn't want them anymore, but because the disappointment had worn us both down to nothing. After James, we tried for another 5 years, more doctors, more treatments, more months of hoping followed by the familiar ache of another negative test. Eventually, we just stopped trying. We filled our days with work instead. I was running a small boat repair business. Martha was teaching 3rd grade at the elementary school, and we told ourselves we were content. But Martha wasn't content, not really. I just didn't want to see it. She'd get this look sometimes when we'd walk past the playground near our house, or when one of her students would talk about their baby brother or sister. She'd go quiet for the rest of the day, and I'd pretend not to notice because I didn't know how to fix it, didn't know how to give her what she wanted most. One evening in late spring, Martha came home from school practically glowing with excitement. She'd been talking to another teacher, Sarah, whose cousin worked for an adoption agency in Portland. Sarah had told her about a program for couples who wanted to adopt older children, kids who'd been overlooked because they weren't babies anymore. Martha sat me down at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast that morning like any other day, and laid out all this information she'd gathered. She had brochures, applications, even a list of children who were waiting for families. I remember looking at their pictures, these kids ranging from 6 to 14 years old, and feeling terrified. Not of them, but of myself. What did I know about raising children? I'd grown up with a father who was either working or drinking, a man who never said, "I love you," or taught me how to throw a baseball, or helped with homework. My own childhood had been about survival, not nurturing, and I was convinced I'd just repeat the same mistakes. Martha talked for over an hour that night about how we could make a difference in a child's life, how we had so much love to give, how our house was too quiet and too empty. She'd even visited the agency that afternoon and picked up the initial paperwork. I can still see her sitting there, holding those forms like they were made of gold, her eyes bright with hope for the first time in years. And I crushed it. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but I crushed it all the same. I told her I wasn't ready, that we were too old to start over with someone else's problems, that we'd built a good life together and shouldn't risk messing it up. I used every excuse I could think of except the real one, that I was scared I'd fail, scared I'd damage some kid who'd already been through enough. Martha folded up those papers without saying a word. She put them in the drawer next to the refrigerator, the one where we kept the phone books and take-out menus, and she never brought up adoption again. Not once. Not even when she'd see stories on news about children needing homes. Not even when her friend Sarah would mention how well the adoption program was working for other families. I thought I'd won, if you can call breaking your wife's heart winning. Life went back to normal, or what I told myself was normal. Martha kept teaching, I kept fixing boats, and we settled into a routine that looked like happiness from the outside. But something had changed between us after that conversation. Not anger, exactly, and not resentment, but a kind of careful distance, like we were both protecting ourselves from hoping for too much. When Martha got sick, pancreatic cancer, the kind that moves fast and doesn't give you time to prepare, she spent her last weeks getting things in order. She organized all her school papers, wrote letters to her favorite students, even planned her own funeral down to the hymns she wanted sung. I found her one afternoon, sitting at that same kitchen table, writing what looked like a list. "What's that, honey?" I asked, and she just smiled and said she was making sure I'd be able to find everything after she was gone. Bills, insurance papers, the deed to the house, all the practical stuff that couples usually share, but that Martha had always handled because she was better with details. After the funeral, after the neighbors stopped bringing casseroles and the phone stopped ringing with condolences, I started going through her papers to understand our finances, to figure out how to live alone. That's when I found it, tucked away in a manila folder labeled Important Documents, the adoption application from 1993. Completely filled out in Martha's careful handwriting. Every question answered, every form signed and dated, even references from friends and co-workers who'd agreed to vouch for us as potential parents. But she'd never turned it in. For 10 years, she kept that completed application, and I never knew. On the cover page, in pencil so light I almost missed it, she'd written a note. "Maybe someday Richard will be ready. Maybe someday we'll have the courage." She dated it just 6 months before she got sick. Sitting there in our empty house, holding those papers, I understood what I'd done to her, what I'd done to us. She'd never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that we could be parents, that we could give a child the love we'd stored up with nowhere to spend it. She just stopped asking me because she knew I'd say no again. Finding Mia and Leo that night felt like Martha reaching across whatever separates the living from the dead to give me one last chance to get it right. I know how that sounds. I'm not a particularly religious man, and I don't usually believe in signs or messages from beyond. But standing on that deck, holding two babies who'd appeared out of nowhere in the middle of a storm, I could almost hear Martha's voice saying, "Here they are, Richard. Here's your chance to be the father you were too afraid to be before." So when I made that decision to bring them home, I wasn't just saving two children. I was trying to honor the woman I'd loved and disappointed, trying to become the man she'd always believed I could be if I just stopped being so afraid of failing. Have you ever gotten a second chance like that? A moment when life gives you the opportunity to fix something you thought was broken forever? I'd love to hear about it in the comments, because I think those moments, when we get to choose courage over fear, those are the moments that define who we really are. You want to know what's funny about deciding to raise two babies when you're 63 years old? Nobody takes you seriously at first. The social workers who showed up at my house 3 days after I brought Mia and Leo home looked at me like I'd lost my mind. This one woman, Patricia something or other, walked through my 4-bedroom house with a clipboard, making notes about everything from the height of my kitchen counters to whether I had proper car seats installed. "Mr. Allett," she said, sitting across from me at that same kitchen table where Martha had filled out those adoption papers years before, "you understand that caring for one infant is challenging for people half your age. 2 infants with no previous parenting experience at your stage of life." She let the sentence hang there like she expected me to suddenly realize my mistake and hand the babies over. But I'd already fallen in love with them. In those 3 days, I'd learned that Mia had this way of grabbing your finger when she was falling asleep, like she was making sure you wouldn't disappear. Leo would only stop crying if you hummed, didn't matter what tune, just had to be something low and steady. They'd both sleep better if their cribs were close together, and they'd wake up around the same time, like they were on some invisible schedule they'd worked out between them. The legal battle took 8 months. 8 months of supervised visits, home inspections, parenting classes, and meetings with lawyers who charged more per hour than I used to make in a week. The state wanted to place them in foster care while they searched for relatives or suitable adoptive families. Patricia kept talking about their best interests, but I knew what their best interests were. They belonged with someone who was already thinking about how to save money for their college funds, someone who'd already child-proofed every cabinet and outlet in the house. I had to take a crash course in everything. Formula temperatures, diaper changing, sleep schedules, when to worry about a fever and when to just watch and wait. My neighbor Ellen, who'd raised 5 kids of her own, became my unofficial advisor. She'd come over at all hours to help me figure out why Leo was fussy or whether Mia's rash needed a doctor's attention. The first time I had to take them both to the pediatrician by myself. I showed up with a diaper bag that weighed more than both babies combined, convinced I'd forgotten something critical. Dr. Martinez, who became their regular doctor, was this young woman who probably thought I was the grandfather bringing them in for their parents. When I explained the situation, she didn't lecture me about my age or my inexperience. She just said, "They look healthy and happy. That's what matters." It was the first time since this whole thing started that someone in an official capacity treated my decision as reasonable instead of ridiculous. The community around Bar Harbor started calling us the Harbor family after about a year. Not because we were famous or anything, but because everywhere we went, people would stop to say hello to Mia and Leo. The grocery store clerks knew their names. The librarian would save picture books for them, and the guys at the marina would always have some little toy or trinket when I brought them down to work on the Wanderer. I learned to do things I'd never imagined. Sterilizing bottles in the tiny galley of my boat when we'd spend long days on the water. Soothing midnight fevers in the rental cottage we'd use during our summer fishing trips up the coast. Teaching them to swim in the harbor when they were 4 and 5, watching them splash around like 2 little seals who belonged in the water more than on land. By the time they started school, People had stopped questioning whether an old fisherman could raise two kids. Leo was reading before kindergarten, and Mia could tie sailors' knots that most adults couldn't figure out. They were polite to adults, kind to other children, and they had this way of looking out for each other that made teachers comment on how unusual it was to see such a strong bond between non-biological siblings. That's what we all assumed they were, brother and sister, who'd somehow ended up in those boats together. They looked enough alike that people never questioned it. Both had dark hair and dark eyes. Both were small for their age, and they had this way of communicating without words that seemed like something only siblings could share. When one got hurt, the other would cry. When one was scared, the other would provide comfort. They chose the same favorite foods, the same favorite books, the same favorite spots on the boat where they'd sit and watch the water. High school was when things started getting complicated, though not in the ways I'd expected. Mia was brilliant, straight A's in everything, especially science and math. She wanted to study marine biology, talked about understanding ocean ecosystems and conservation. Leo was more artistic, always drawing or building things with his hands. He was good in school too, but he learned differently, needed to see and touch things to understand them. They started asking questions about their past around the time they turned 16. Natural questions. Where did they come from? Who were their birth parents? Did they have other family out there somewhere? I told them everything I knew, which wasn't much. The storm, the boats, the letters M and L, the complete absence of any other information. I tried over the years to find out more, contacted police departments and hospitals up and down the coast, but 2003 was before everything was digital, and missing persons reports from that time weren't well organized. Leo's 18th birthday was on March 15th, 2021. Mia had turned 18 3 months earlier. We'd always celebrated their birthdays based on when I found them, since we didn't know their real birth dates. Leo had gotten into this genealogy kick after taking a biology class about genetics, and he'd been saving money from his part-time job at the marina to buy one of those DNA testing kits. "Come on, Pops," he said, grinning as he opened the package. "Let's find our roots. Maybe we've got cousins somewhere, or aunts and uncles who've been wondering what happened to us all these years." He was so excited about the possibility of discovering family that I didn't have the heart to tell him I was afraid of what we might find, afraid that someone somewhere might have a legal claim to them that could tear apart the only family any of us had ever really known. We all did the tests. Even I participated, partly because I was curious about my own Irish and Scottish heritage, and partly because I wanted to be supportive. The results were supposed to take 6 to 8 weeks, but Leo checked the website every single day like a kid waiting for Christmas morning. When the email finally came saying our results were ready, we gathered around my old computer in the kitchen to look at them together. My results were pretty much what I expected, mostly Irish and Scottish, with a little bit of English thrown in. Mia showed a complex mix of Eastern European and Mediterranean ancestry, and Leo's revealed primarily Italian and Greek heritage, but it was the family connections that changed everything. The website showed genetic matches with potential relatives, and while Leo had several distant cousins showing up, Mia had none. More importantly, when I compared their profiles, the system showed no genetic relationship between them at all. Not siblings, not cousins, not even distantly related. The silence in that kitchen was deafening. Leo stared at the screen for a long time, then looked at Mia, then at me. "We're not brother and sister," he said, and it wasn't a question. Mia started crying, not the angry kind of crying, but the deep, lost kind that sounds like something breaking inside. "So we're not really family," she whispered. "We're just two random kids who happen to end up in the same place." I try to tell them that DNA doesn't determine family, that love and shared experiences and choosing to stick together is what makes people relatives. But they were 18 years old, trying to figure out who they were and where they belonged in the world, and this news hit them like a physical blow. The months that followed were the hardest we'd ever faced as a family. Mia became withdrawn, spending hours researching her genetic matches, trying to find some connection to her past. She'd always been the more serious of the two, but now she seemed to be carrying some weight I couldn't understand. Her grades started slipping. She stopped talking about college, and she'd spend long periods just staring out at the water from her bedroom window. Leo dealt with it differently. He threw himself into planning his future, filled out applications for the Navy, started talking about seeing the world and finding his place in it. "I need to know who I really am," he told me one evening when I found him packing his things. "I love you, Dad, and you'll always be my dad, but I can't just pretend anymore that I know where I come from." They barely spoke to each other during this time, and it was like watching two parts of my heart tear away from each other. These kids who'd never spent a day apart, who'd shared every experience and every milestone, suddenly couldn't figure out how to be in the same room. Mia would leave when Leo entered. Leo would find excuses to be out when Mia was home, and I was caught in the middle, trying to hold together a family that was falling apart over something that had happened before any of us could remember. Leo left for boot camp in September 2021, just 6 months after we'd gotten those test results. Mia enrolled in community college, but dropped out after 1 semester. For nearly 2 years, our house felt like a tomb. Mia would work her shifts at the local bookstore, come home, eat dinner in silence, and disappear to her room. Leo would call once a week from wherever the Navy had stationed him, but our conversations were brief and careful, like we were all afraid of saying something that might make the situation worse. I thought I'd lost them both, not to death or disaster, but to the simple, brutal fact that learning the truth about their past had somehow erased the 18 years we'd spent building our life together. I started wondering if I'd made a terrible mistake that night in 2003, if I should have let the authorities handle the situation instead of thinking I could create a family out of love and good intentions. Then, on a Tuesday morning in April 2023, my phone rang. It was Leo, calling from Norfolk where he was stationed. "Dad," he said, and his voice sounded different, more serious than I'd heard since he was a little boy. "I need you to meet me and Mia at the old marina this Saturday. There's someone you need to meet." "Mia," I said. "You've been talking to Mia? Just trust me on this one, okay? Can you be there at 2 o'clock? Pier 7, where you used to dock the Wanderer." I spent 3 days wondering what was happening, whether this meant they'd found some way to repair their relationship, whether this mysterious person was connected to their past in some way I couldn't imagine. When Saturday came, I got to the marina early and sat on the bench overlooking the harbor, watching boats come and go, trying to prepare myself for whatever was about to happen. Leo arrived first, looking older than his 20 years in his Navy uniform. He hugged me longer than usual, and I could feel some tension in his shoulders that told me this wasn't going to be a simple family reunion. Mia showed up a few minutes later, and she looked like she'd been crying recently, but also like she'd found some kind of peace I hadn't seen in her face for 2 years. "Dad," Leo said, taking my hand and Mia's hand at the same time. "Before she gets here, I need you to know that what you're about to learn doesn't change anything between us. You're our father, this is our family, and nothing anyone tells us about the past is going to change that." That's when I saw her, walking down the pier toward us. A woman, maybe in her 40s, with dark hair like Mia's and the same careful way of moving. She was holding a manila envelope, and when she got close enough for me to see her face clearly, my blood ran cold, because I'd seen those eyes before, 18 years ago, in the face of a 3-month-old baby girl floating in a yellow dinghy in the middle of a storm. The woman walking toward us had Mia's exact same eyes, not just the color, but the shape, the way they seemed to take in everything before deciding whether to trust what they were seeing. She moved carefully, like someone who'd learned to be cautious about sudden movements or loud noises. When she got within speaking distance, she stopped and looked directly at me. "You're Richard," she said, and her voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place. "You're the man who saved my daughter." Her name was Elena Kozlov, and she sat down on that bench beside the harbor to tell us a story that explained everything and nothing all at once. She'd been 19 years old in 2003, living in a small village outside Minsk when men came to her town with promises of work in America. Good jobs, they said, cleaning houses for wealthy families, enough money to send home to help her parents and younger siblings. Elena was smart. She'd finished school, spoke 3 languages, and dreamed of becoming a teacher. But her family was struggling, and the opportunity seemed like a gift. She signed papers she couldn't read, traveled with documents she didn't understand, and found herself in a warehouse in Boston instead of the comfortable home she'd been promised. "They took my passport," she said, staring out at the water as she spoke. "Told me I owed them money for transportation, for housing, for food. The debt kept growing no matter how much work I did. There were 12 other girls there, some as young as 15. Elena had gotten pregnant during her 2nd year in captivity. She'd managed to hide it for 6 months, terrified of what would happen if her captors found out. When they finally discovered her condition, they were furious. A pregnant woman couldn't do the kind of work they required. They said they would kill the baby after it was born." Elena continued. "But I gave birth earlier than expected, in that warehouse, with only one of the other girls to help me. When Mia was born, I knew I had to find a way to get her to safety." She'd spent 3 months planning her escape, learning the schedules of the guards, figuring out how to get from Boston to the coast of Maine. The night of the storm, she'd stolen a car and driven to Bar Harbor with Mia hidden under blankets in the back seat. "I found that little boat on the beach," Elena said. "I thought if I could get far enough from shore, someone would find her and take care of her. I knew I couldn't keep her safe, but maybe someone else could." She put Mia in the dinghy with the hospital bracelet she'd managed to keep, kissed her goodbye, and pushed the boat out into the waves. But she wasn't the only one who'd planned an escape that night. "Leo," Elena said, turning to look at the young man who'd been listening to this story with growing confusion and horror. Leo was in the warehouse too. His parents, the people who gave birth to him, they worked for the same organization that held me. Leo's face went completely white. "What are you saying?" "Your father was named Viktor Petrov. Your mother was Anya. They had brought you to Boston when you were just a few weeks old, but you cried constantly, and the sound attracted attention they couldn't afford. You were supposed to be their cover story, a young family starting a new life in America, but instead you were becoming a liability." Elena explained that Victor and Anya had decided to abandon Leo the same night she'd planned her escape with Mia. They'd driven separately to the coast, planning to dump him in the water and report him as accidentally lost if anyone ever asked questions. "They threw you overboard in that crate," Elena said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw them do it. I was already in the water with Mia's boat when I heard you crying. I tried to reach you, but the waves were too strong." Leo had been completely silent during this explanation, but now he stood up and walked to the edge of the pier. I could see his shoulders shaking, and when I went to put my hand on his back, he turned around with tears streaming down his face. "So I'm the son of criminals," he said. "The people who hurt her, who hurt all those other women. Those are my biological parents." "No," Elena said firmly, standing up and walking over to him. "You are the son of Richard Allard. You are the brother of Mia Allard. You are a young man who has spent 20 years bringing joy and love into the world. Who your biological parents were doesn't define who you are." Mia, who'd been quiet through most of this story, suddenly got up and sat down beside Leo. "You know what I was thinking about while she was talking?" she said. "I was thinking about that time when we were 7 and that kid at school was picking on me because I was smaller than everyone else. You remember what you did." Leo looked up. "I sat with you at lunch every day for 2 weeks until he got bored and moved on to someone else." "You could have just ignored it," Mia said. You could have decided it wasn't your problem, but you didn't, because that's not who you are. She took his hand, the same way they used to hold hands when they were little and crossing busy streets. You want to know what defines you? 20 years of choosing to be kind when you could have been cruel. 20 years of protecting people who needed protecting. Elena was crying now too, watching these two young people who'd found each other in the worst possible circumstances and built something beautiful together. Mia's right, she said. I gave birth to her, but you've been her real family. Both of you. That's when Leo looked at me, really looked at me, and said something that still makes me emotional when I think about it. Dad, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I pulled away when we found out we weren't biological siblings. You're our real father, and this is our real family, and I was an idiot to think anything else mattered. The months that followed were complicated in the best possible way. Elena moved to Maine to be closer to Mia, but she didn't try to replace me as a parent. Instead, she became something new, a bridge to Mia's heritage, a source of stories about her early life. We all went to therapy to work through the trauma of Elena's story and the complex emotions of reuniting after 20 years. We also worked with federal authorities to track down Victor and Anya Petrov. Elena's information, combined with Leo's DNA and some investigation by the FBI, led to their arrest in 2024. Leo struggled with this at first. It's hard to celebrate your biological parents going to prison, but eventually he found peace in knowing that justice had been served. The most beautiful part of this whole story is watching how our family has grown. Elena and Mia spend hours together, cooking traditional dishes and learning about their shared heritage. Leo has started studying criminal justice, inspired by Elena's story. And me, I get to be grandfather to Leo's son, who they named James Richard, and to Mia's daughter Elena, who's learning to sail on the same boat where I found her mother and uncle 20 years ago. Family isn't about blood or genetics. It's about the choice to love someone through good times and bad, to show up when they need you, to build something together that's stronger than what any of you could create alone. Sometimes storms bring you exactly what you didn't know you needed, exactly when you're ready to receive it. Now here I am at 83, sitting on my porch overlooking the same harbor where this whole story began, watching my granddaughter Elena learn to tie bowline knots with the same concentrated frown her mother used to get when she was learning. Mia's out there on the Wanderer with her, teaching her how to read the wind and feel the rhythm of the waves. That little girl has salt water in her veins, just like her mother did, just like her grandmother Elena does too, even though she grew up hundreds of miles from any ocean. Leo's boy James, we call him Jimmy. He's got different interests. Kid's fascinated by engines, wants to know how everything works under the hood. Last weekend, he spent 4 hours with me in the garage, taking apart an old outboard motor and putting it back together. He's got his father's careful hands and his grandfather's, my stubborn streak when it comes to fixing things that other people might throw away. The Wanderer's still seaworthy after all these years, though she's showing her age like the rest of us. Leo's been after me to let him restore her properly, update some of the electronics, maybe add a few safety features that weren't common back in 2003. But I keep telling him she's perfect the way she is. That old boat didn't just save 2 babies that night. She saved me from drowning in my own grief, gave me a purpose I never expected to have at my age. Sometimes when I'm out on the water with the grandkids, I think about that storm, about the choices I made that night, and all the ways things could have gone differently. If I'd been 5 minutes later getting to that spot, if the weather had been just a little bit worse, if I'd listened to that Coast Guard officer and handed Mia and Leo over to the system. But then Jimmy asks me to show him how to steer into the waves, or little Elena points out a seal swimming alongside the boat, and I stop thinking about what-if scenarios. This is how it was supposed to happen. This is exactly where we were all meant to end up. Elena, Mia's birth mother, she comes out with us sometimes now. She's learned to love the water even though it represents both the worst and best moments of her life. She tells the kids stories about Belarus, about their grandmother Martha, whom they never got to meet, about the importance of remembering where you come from while appreciating where you've ended up. She's become the keeper of our family history, the one who makes sure nobody forgets how extraordinary it is that we all found each other. If this story has touched you at all, if it's made you think about your own family or your own defining moments, I'd be grateful if you take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. But more than that, I want to hear from you. What's been your defining life moment? The thing that changed everything? That took your life in a direction you never saw coming? Was it something dramatic like a storm at sea? Or was it quieter? A conversation, a decision, a moment when you chose courage over fear? I read every single comment that comes in, and at my age, hearing about other people's stories has become one of my greatest pleasures. We're all connected by these moments when life surprises us, when we discover we're stronger or more loving or more resilient than we ever imagined we could be. And if you're going through a storm right now, literal or metaphorical, remember that sometimes the things that seem like endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Sometimes the worst nights lead to the most beautiful mornings. Sometimes what looks like loss is actually preparation for something better than you ever dare to hope for. This is Richard Allard, signing off from Bar Harbor, Maine, where the lighthouse still guides boats safely home, and where an old fisherman learned that it's never too late to become the father you were meant to be. Take care of each other out there, and remember to look for the miracles hiding in your storms. Until next time.